Cue the intro!
Information security. World-renowned professor and all-around good guy Tim Ch6 is ready to take you to the other side. So get ready, stand tall, square your shoulders, and open up the door.
You can't be sure till you open up the door. Open up the door. Open up the door.
All right. Welcome to this online edition of Chapter 6, CMIS422. We were rudely interrupted by an ice storm on Thursday, so we're just going to cover some material online together. But as usual, let me know if you've got questions. We can talk about this stuff via email, via phone call, via office, assuming campus is going to be open. It's snowing right now, so we'll see what happens this week. So remember, this week we've got we're going to talk about intrusion detection protection systems. If we meet this Thursday, we'll probably meet Thursday, and then the following week is spring break, if you can believe it. And then as soon as you get back, I'm so sorry, but you have an exam to look forward to. But the good news is you've got plenty of time to relax, do some studying, work on some tests out. It'll all be good. It'll all work out. So do go ahead and read Chapter 7 on IDPS systems for next time we get together, and keep working on test out. Tell you what, if you found some good news items this week, why don't you just email them to me, and let me know not just what the issue was, but kind of your interpretation of it and why it would be important for us to talk about in class. Put it that way, and of course what your source is, and send me a link, and we can just do it that way this time. I do have some slides in here just to review the prior chapter. You can go through these on your own time, and I will be posting a study guide on Blackboard for the next exam right after this, so do refer to these questions and the study guide as you prepare for the exam. Chapter 6 is on why technology sucks. Yeah, I said it. If we're protecting an information system, the information in an information system, we have to have a variety of people controls, process controls, and technology controls. So when we were talking about governance before, that's squarely in the process controls, which I think is much more important. And then, of course, people controls are a matter of training and HR and management of employee behavior, employees being the weakest link. But technology controls are kind of the most interesting for IT people to get into. We want to put all of our faith in technology. I urge you not to make that fallacy of thinking, to put all of your confidence in your hardware and your technology, and I'll try to show you some reasons why in this chapter and the next chapter. All right, learning objectives for Chapter 6, a little bit about access control, a lot about authentication, a good bit on firewalls, and we'll wrap up with some VPN stuff. So I don't want to say just because technology controls aren't the be-all end-all that we don't need them. Of course we need them. They serve a very important function because a human being manager can't monitor every single website you go to 24/7. A computer technology control is a much better tool for that sort of thing. So there is a place for technology controls, but in the larger frame of people, process, and technology. Definition of access control for the exam: method by which systems determine whether and how to admit a user into a trusted area of the organization. Typically when we're talking about access, we're talking about ACLs, access control lists, and access to resources on the network. So a resource can be server, a printer, your own PC or laptop that was issued to you. Please remember that the IT department gives you access, but authorization comes from the business. So authorization and access are two distinct things. In order to give you access to a resource, be it a server, printer, PC, folder, whatever, there has to be some way of identifying who or what the thing is. So the book kind of focuses on people, although keep in mind that we need identification for servers and printers, hence they have some kind of label attached to them. So for the exam, identification is the mechanism for unverified entities seeking access to a resource to provide a label by which they're known to the system. So it's just a label. Your username, your EID, for example, your social security number. These are all methods of identification. Your driver's license number, so forth. Once you've been issued an ID, that's not good enough. The next step to give you access is for you to validate that you are who you say you are. And you being the supplicant. And this is weird language. This is kind of specific to information security. But a supplicant comes from the Latin, someone who beseeches, please, I entreat you to allow me to do something, to entreat humbly. That's right. We want our end users to be humble. They're humble supplicants. There's a slightly religious tone to this, which I'm kind of okay with. So authentication is, there are a number of ways to authenticate who you are. It might be something that you know, such as a password, passphrase, PIN number. It might be something that you have, such as an ID card that you swipe with a mag stripe on it. Hard tokens are getting more and more common to be issued to employees to help identify them. Just something you keep on your keychain. Or something that you are, which gets into biometric authentication. We'll talk about how that works and how it doesn't work. There are a lot of vocabulary words in this chapter that start with the letter A. Hence, you know I'm going to ask you some questions to try to trip you up. Not to trip you up, to give you a chance to demonstrate that you know the difference between access, authorization, authentication, accountability, and so forth. So authorization, the matching of an authenticated entity to a list of information assets. So it could be a server, it could be a printer, it could be a PC. Just access within... You're authorized to access something within the Active Directory, to get more specific. Authorization comes from the business. Access comes from IT. Accountability. Accountability means we're tracking things. Typically in IT, this means we're looking at log files. System administrators look at log files, but more importantly, for a career in cybersecurity, auditors love to look at log files to make sure that the right people are accessing the right things that they've got, that they're authorized to access. So biometric authentication was going to be a big thing. I mean, I remember when they started building in the finger swipes on laptops several years ago. It just came standard, and now they've done away with it. It's not... doesn't necessarily come standard. You still see it on some, and of course you've got it on your phone, the fingerprint recognition. Of course, if you're like me, you've had a problem at some point. If there's moisture, sweat, liquid, water, whatever on your thumb, it's not going to read it, and then you're kind of drying off your thumb and wiping off your phone to get a clean imprint. So that can be an issue. Certainly, if you've ever super glued your fingertips, that changes your fingerprint. Or maybe I'm the only one that's ever done that. The book talks about how your fingerprints are unique throughout your life, as well as the retina and iris. I disagree. In fact, specifically for fingerprints, I sat through a pretty interesting presentation 2 years ago at an academic conference on fingerprinting technology, fingerprint scanning technology, and how your fingerprints really empirically change throughout your life. That you have microabrasions that occur to your fingertips, especially if you work with your hands a lot over time, so that your fingerprints do change, and it will not be easy to compare somebody's fingerprint from when they're 20 to when they're 40 to when they're 60. Our bodies change. I think that's the fundamental issue with anything with biometrics. Our bodies change through time. It's not a constant. It's probably a good thing. But there are kind of issues with all these. Certainly, your voice changes over time. And if you've got a cold, it changes. Now, I know we're doing a lot with voice recognition, and it seems to be improving. None of these are perfect. Facial recognition gets into some very embarrassing issues where our facial recognition technology is not able to distinguish people from certain races. That gets embarrassing in a hurry. So I don't see that going anywhere. So there are just problems with all forms of biometric authentication at this point. Remember, this is not access. This is authentication, validating you are who you say you are. I would encourage you to take a look at this video. You should be able to launch it from the PowerPoint, but it talks about some newer technology about measuring the sclera in your eye as being a truly unique kind of constellation of veins that belongs to you and you alone in your eyeball. I don't know, I think eyes change. I went in for a retinal exam a couple of weeks ago, and I developed holes in my retina, which I'm monitoring. In fact, I've got a checkup coming up at the Retina Institute too. So I think your retina does change over time. The other issue you'll see in this video is, while this may be a very advanced technique, it's also a very expensive technique. What's a cheaper technique for authentication? Usernames and passwords. That's why we still use them. Pop quiz. I really wish I could see your faces when I ask you this question. But what is EduRoam? What does it do? Every class they go, oh yeah, we know EduRoam. That's what gives us access to Wi-Fi. No, negative. No. EduRoam provides shared authentication services via the cloud to multiple campuses across the U.S. and around the world. It is for authentication. That'll be on the test. Yeah. There's more info at eduroam.org, and there's a list of institutions that are supposed to be partners with EduRoam. So I've been to other campuses where I've been able to authenticate with my EID just fine, and then some campuses where it doesn't work. So this is still a work in progress. I'm curious if you guys have run into this, if you had a chance to try this out at other campuses. Well, look, here's some text that's big, bold, and red. That must mean it's really, really important. The device that separates a trusted network from an untrusted network. What is that? Is it a router? No, it is not a router. It is, in fact, a firewall. The firewall is the demarcation point between the trusted inside and untrusted outside network. But trusted versus untrusted is kind of pegs you as a security person. If you talk about inside, outside, or LAN, WAN, you're a networking person. If you talk about trusted versus untrusted, you're a cybersecurity person. So it's good to use that language in an interview if you're interviewing for a cyber position. The other kind of weird language is ingress and egress. So ingress traffic is coming into the network, into the trusted network. Egress traffic is going out. Again, just kind of weird language we use in security. I do get questions from time to time from students about software firewalls and if those are good enough. And my answer is a clear no, they're not good enough. And here's why. If some piece of malware or something gets all the way past, here, let's go back up here, from the internet, gets into the network and gets all the way into the network to your laptop or PC, and that's the point where you want to catch it, I'd say it's too late. If you've got anything here that's trying to catch malware, we want it blocked here, not here. At the demarcation point, not here. Another reason I don't like software firewalls is they're extraordinarily chatty. Do you want to allow this traffic? Do you want to allow this traffic? This is trying to access your system. Do you want to allow this? Most end users have no idea the right or wrong answers to these questions. I mean, you guys and gals know the answers. You're CMIS and CS folks. But yeah, end users, I think it just causes more problems than it's worth. That said, I will retract my strong stance just a hair and say maybe it's okay to have a belt and suspenders approach where you have a hardware firewall and you also have software firewalls in every single machine, just because we're getting into an era where everybody's paranoid, and if you're Google, the way Google treats their internal network is nothing is trusted. There's no such thing as a trusted network at Google. Every host on the network is considered an untrusted device. That is a big mind shift to get into, but more and more companies are looking at that way. So I can't say never use a firewall, but I'm really not a big fan of software firewalls. Software is always slower than hardware. Hardware is better than software. I'm a hardware guy, but hardware is always better. Just more language. We need to stick with trusted versus untrusted, not these networking terms. What does a firewall look like? It looks remarkably like a router. For example, the Cisco ASA series, just like a router, is going to have an in and an out. In terms of size, it's probably one rack unit. Some tend to be bigger, but only if it's a whole unified threat management or security appliance box. It might be 3 or 5 rack units in size, but typically they're pretty small, pizza box size boxes. You see on here the couple of switch ports, and you're like, what is that? This is actually for an extranet, which I can show you on a future picture. But this is just to kind of, if you just have one firewall in place instead of 2 firewalls, which is probably more recommended. But this is just a way of saving having to have a separate switch in your extranet, because you have to have a place to plug in your servers. So that's just a for instance of what one looks like. But it's only from the back you can really see what's going on. From the front, unless you just look up the model number, you have no way of telling that it's a firewall. Okay, just to give you some examples, obviously I'm more comfortable with the Cisco lineup of firewalls. These are enterprise class, so you can see, the ASA series, the Firepower series is a little newer, and get rid of that, get rid of this, and security appliances. Please note that Cisco owns Meraki now, which is a very big deal. Meraki used to be just management of cloud-based management of Wi-Fi devices, access points. Meraki now does switches and switch management for managed switches and security appliances. So that's kind of it's a growth area for Cisco and for Meraki. Cisco has a lot of name recognition, but you know it's a big deal when they keep the name Meraki of the company that they acquired, because Meraki has such a good reputation in the industry now. Notice that the differences are going to be, the type of firewall it is, which we're going to get into in this chapter, as well as throughput and processing power. And if you look at a data sheet for a firewall, it's going to look remarkably like the spec sheet for a PC or a server. And by that I mean you're going to have processing speed, an amount of memory, and input-output speed. And if you think back to CMIS422, this is the definition of a computer, something that has a processor, storage, in and out, input-output communication. So a firewall is a computer. It is a computer, like in the Cisco world, that's running an operating system called iOS, the Internet Working Operating System. All Cisco gear runs iOS. So firewalls, routers, switches, access points, security appliances, everything. It all runs iOS. So if you learn the iOS operating system, you know how to configure anything that belongs to Cisco. But here's the thing. What's iOS based on? Cisco's iOS is based on Unix, i.e. Linux, which is why we keep beating you up in the program to anything you can do to kind of learn more Linux on the side. It's just going to prepare you for the workplace. And it's not just Cisco. It's WatchGuard, it's SonicWall, it's Juniper, it's Checkpoint. All these people are just running Linux on the back end. So it's nothing fancy. It's just a computer running Linux. You with me? We've got 4 different types of firewalls, and there are pros and cons to each one. Obviously, the 4th one's probably the most important. That's why I've got it in red, just because that's where the industry is going. That's what's most widely in use. So the first one, the simplest kind of firewall, is just filtering packets. So packets are at layer 3, as you'll recall from CMIS422. So it's looking at the IP source address and destination address, where it's going, where it came from, whether it's inbound or outbound, and what port it's coming in on. So to get more precise, we're looking at a socket, the combination of an IP address and a port. So the firewall rules will just look like a table that shows the source, destination, what the protocol is, which is exactly the same thing as the port number. Whether I list the protocol here or the port number, it's exactly the same information. And whether I'm going to allow it or deny it. This is called whitelisting and blacklisting. This is why port numbers are so critically important. And if you're going for any kind of Cisco certification or any advanced security cert, you're going to need to start memorizing port numbers. So a firewall that's doing packet filtering, I don't know why we're calling it packet filtering router. I mean, you can argue that there's not much different, that a firewall is a highly specialized router, but I'd rather not get that pedantic with you. So a packet filtering firewall, if it's a malformed packet coming in, it's going to block it. Great. And if it's a allowed packet, it is going to allow it into the trusted network. Great. That sounds fantastic. But there's a problem. If a firewall can't recognize, it's not on its white list, it's not on its black list, it doesn't know if it's a good or bad, allowed or unallowed packet. If it's not sure, it allows it. Yeah, I said it. The default is to allow the packet in. That's not good security, right? So stateful packet inspection means a firewall is looking at the initial state, which is the opening of the connection when somebody initially knocks on the door. So in TCP, that handshaking step of TCP is when it's examining. It's not looking at every packet after that in the same conversation or connection. Just the initial one. But if it's not sure, it's going to allow it in. Wah, wah, wah. The second type of firewall is a little smarter. So instead of just looking at layer 3 and layer 4, it's going to go all the way up to layer 5 and open up the contents of the packet and look at it. Sometimes this is called a proxy server, a cache server. To me, this is very similar to what a content filtering firewall can do. But any application layer firewall is going all the way up to layer 5 and doing something, either on the way into the network or the way out of the network. A MAC layer firewall that's looking at the MAC address and blocking MAC address, whitelisting, blacklisting by MAC address, you would think would be a great way to do it, because a MAC address is the physical address that's burned into a network card. So it's impossible to change your MAC address, except it's totally possible to change your MAC address. In Windows, you have to download a special application, to just a little utility that'll change your MAC address so you can spoof your MAC address. My daughter figured out how to do this in about 20 minutes to get around my internet security at home when she was a teenager. Long story, it has a terrible ending, but yeah. So don't rely on MAC address filtering or firewalling. It is a way to do it. It's not the best way. Also, native to Linux, you can change your MAC address, because everything in Linux is a text file. Everything in Linux is a text file. So your MAC address is just in a text file. You can delete over it, put in whatever MAC address you want, which is another reason why Linux is the operating system of hackers. Before we go into the last one, let's just look at where we are so far. So a MAC firewall is looking at information from layer 2. A packet filtering firewall is looking at information from layer 3. Stateful packet inspection is looking at layer 4 because it's looking at the initial state, the TCP handshaking process. Application layer firewall is obviously looking at layer 5. For those of you that have learned the 7-layer OSI model, that's fine. We typically use the 5-layer model in the School of Business so that these 3 get lumped together in one layer 5. The way the industry is changing is to kind of beef up the firewall to do a whole lot more and do all of those activities up and down the stack and more. So a hybrid firewall, more commonly, if you're like doing a search on cdw.com for new gear, if you look for UTM, Unified Threat Management, a security, also a security appliance is kind of the generic term, but any device that's going up and down the stack, that's it's acting as a firewall. It's also doing intrusion protection that we'll talk about next time. It's also your VPN endpoint, which we'll talk about at the end of this chapter. It's doing content filtering on egress traffic, maybe monitoring spyware, doing some antivirus stuff, even some spam stuff and phishing protection, and general email security, all in one box. That's a security appliance that's doing unified threat management. If you're wondering who has the best UTM systems out there, if I need this information, I'm just going to go to Gartner. The easy way to do this, super easy. You have no excuse not to do this. If you want to be a cyber professional, just do a Google image search on Gartner Magic Quadrant, and then whatever keywords you want, UTM, firewall, router, whatever you're looking for. Notice here that this might be from a couple of years ago, but Fortinet has been a leader in this space. Cisco's over here. They're rated high, but on the kind of visionary matrix here, Checkpoint is a big one. Sophos is all right. WatchGuard, they're all right, but they're pretty cheap. Fortinet seems to be a leader, which is why I include, just so you don't think I'm a total Cisco bigot, a link for Fortinet that I want you to watch to kind of orient you on how they do unified threat management. So even though Fortinet probably has the strongest offering just right now at this point of time, they don't have as much market share as Cisco does. Cisco is still the behemoth in the telecom industry, with Checkpoint nipping at their heels. Just some data points for you for reference. All of these companies have something in the way of NGFWs, next generation firewalls. I really don't like this term anymore, next generation firewall, because the term has been out for 5, 6, 7 years. This really isn't next generation. This is now just currently what firewalls are doing, which is going all the way up and down the stack. So I do want you to watch this video also, the first 4.5 minutes, to get an introduction to next generation firewalls and how they're different from just a plain old kind of dumb first generation firewall. Oh yeah, also this guy is kind of a hick, and I apologize for the accent, but you're going to have to talk to people from all parts of the country when you get into IT, so you need to learn to deal with different accents for different parts of the country, okay? So good luck. Alright, we've talked about 4 different types of firewall that you can purchase. Now to implement them, the way you lay it out on your network, there are 4 different kind of big ways that 4 possibilities. I really just want to talk about the 4th one, which again is the most common and probably the most secure. So a screen subnet firewall topology, which is the dominant one today. Just think 2. You've got 2 firewalls doing a couple of things. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Here's your external and internal. Again, they call them routers. It's a specialized, a firewall is a specialized router, but it is doing routing technically. So an outside firewall and an inside firewall. And in between these two, this is your DMZ, your demilitarized zone, kind of no man's land. You're neither on the trusted network nor are you on the untrusted network. It's a no man's land in between. This is where you can put different boxes, like a mail server, like a proxy server for filtering traffic, a web server so that people can get to your web server, but you would never put your web server inside your network. You don't want to pull all that dirty, ugly, nasty internet traffic all the way into your trusted network. Keep that kind of outside. I've worked in organizations where we'd put a server with pricing information for just our customers and give our customers a login so that they can access the server and get their custom pricing. Not all customers pay the same price. This is a good, this is an early business lesson for me, where depending on who you were, you paid a different price. That just strikes me as un-American, but that's the way business works. if there's any box you want to bring your third parties, your suppliers, your vendors, your strategic partners in to give them a little bit more access than everybody on the internet, that's going to go in your DMZ, and this is the place to put it between these two. Notice how your IP address scheme can change from here to here to here. Yeah, so dual homed or a screen subnet firewall with DMZ. This is the most common way to do it. So if you just have one firewall, you're making it do a lot more work, and it's also kind of a single point of takeover. Whereas this is a better illustration of defense in depth, where you have to get through multiple obstacles of security to get to the trusted network. And if you're wondering, how do I know if I need a DMZ or not? This is why you're going to earn top dollar, because you understand that the business needs, the business requirements, are what drive all technology decisions. It is that simple. I mentioned single point of takeover. You may also have noticed a single point of failure with those firewalls in the previous diagram. It is possible, and in fact a good idea, to have two different boxes working in tandem. For high availability, HA just stands for high availability. It's an acronym we use all the time in security and technology in general, for servers, for database storage, for routers, switches. High availability is in use for any piece of hardware. But your firewall, in case one firewall dies, you can have two firewalls that are connected with a simple, it's just another network cable that's connected back to back. Sometimes it's a crossover cable, sometimes not. But it's just sending a heartbeat connection. Anytime you see the word heartbeat, that means ping. They're just pinging each other to make sure they're online, and as soon as one of them loses track with the other takes over the full load. Now if you have both of them working at the same time, that's load balancing. If one is turned on and if this one fails, then everything switches over to this one that's kind of on standby mode. That's failover mode. So load balancing, you're using both. Failover, this one's working, and then when it stops working, this one starts working. In either case, they have to have a heartbeat cable going from one firewall to the next. And if you're thinking, well, does that mean I might have 4 firewalls? Yes, it does. Most of you have had me before, and you know my song and dance about how a castle is a great illustration of defense in depth, that you have to kind of get through the initial gate, you have to authenticate from a guard, you have to get through multiple obstacles, you might have 2 gates that can drop down here, you have to get into the courtyard, you have to get into the towers. There are different layers of security to get into a castle. I especially like these kind of 2 gates up here, because that's a very good approximation of what the screen subnet topology looks like, with 2 firewalls, a firewall here and a firewall there, and then a kind of no man's land in between, where you can pour hot boiling oil on your intruders if they fail to authenticate themselves correctly. The problem is we can't think of our perimeter this way anymore. We can't think of the network perimeter between the trusted and the untrusted network as a physical square that we can draw, or circle that we can draw easily around our network. It's just not that easy anymore. What's much more common is to talk about the fluid perimeter, and I'm not talking about the moat around the castle, right? The fluid perimeter, anything that's fluid is changing, it's dynamic, it's moving around. So instead of thinking of the firewall as being the gate between outside and inside, thinking that there are many, many, many different ways of getting into the network, and that they're changing all the time. You might temporarily bring up a VPN with another location. You might temporarily bring in mobile users from different locations around the world. It gets complicated in a hurry, including access point access. If you are broadcasting Wi-Fi signal out into your parking lot, now somebody can sit out in the parking lot and access your network, but they're not physically inside your network. If you see what I'm saying there, it's very fluid. I briefly talked about some different brand names of firewalls, and if you're on a selection committee to pick a new firewall technology for your company, there are a number of things you need to look at. Number one, of course, is the business requirements, which sounds easier than it is, but documenting what it is that the business needs from a information protection aspect and the value of the information that you're trying to protect. That's going to drive how much you are able to spend on your firewall or security appliance. There's always a trade-off between protection and cost, as well as a trade-off between protection and access. There's a laundry list of features that you can pay extra for on a firewall. How easy it is to set up, how easy is it to do ongoing management and ongoing monitoring, and how scalable is it? How much can it grow? And this typically is a matter of processing and memory and throughput that it can handle. But this last one is one of the earliest business lessons I got from the plant manager, where I was nobody in the plant. I was basically sweeping the floors, but I got into my first IT position, and he wanted me to do some research on some piece of network gear, and he asked me to determine the total cost. And so I looked up the price tag of here's what this box costs, and so here's what it's going to cost you. And he said, "Son," I hate it when people say that. "Son, the price is not the cost." I'm like, what? The price is the initial number that you pay up front. The cost is everything you pay over the course of the life of that box. So the total cost includes the time it takes to set it up, if there's a training cost for your system administrators, if there's training cost for your end users, if there's a cost for support and management, which typically with Cisco, that's 18% of the price tag is going to be your yearly support cost. If there's a cost for calling in your yearly service contract, for escalating to the vendor, there are different levels of SLA that typically you pay extra for. There's the cost of downtime. There's a lot of, some of these are intangible, some of these are hidden costs, but they all have, his point was, they all have to be factored in to the total cost. So this is what's known as TCO, total cost of ownership. If you can throw out TCO in an interview, you are showcasing that you understand how businesses make decisions. I swear to God, it's that important. Just the acronym TCO is a business term that's so much more important than any technology acronym you're going to learn in my class or any class. The part of the process of deciding on new technology is sending out a request for information, which is a short document, or a request for proposal, RFP, which is a longer document that involves a lot of writing. So you have to write up your business requirements and what you're looking for. You send that off to your top 3 vendors that you've selected. They will respond with a notebook-sized binder of information to respond to your RFP. You might be familiar with the concept if you've ever shopped for a car and maybe you made up a simple kind of list of requirements of things you're looking for. Now multiply that by 10 when you're spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars on security. You're going to have to document very thoroughly the step-by-step process you went through to make your decision. I would emphasize the manageability aspects of the firewall. Being able to manage it remotely, make changes remotely, upgrade the firmware easily. We talked about redundancy and single point of failure, and I mentioned why Cisco's iOS is so popular, because if you learn Cisco iOS, you know how to configure any network device that's also a Cisco brand device, which is pretty cool. Alrighty, let's assume that you've decided on which firewall to buy. You bought it, you've got it installed in place, it's racked in the rack, you've given it that initial configuration to give it an IP address so that you can manage it remotely. Now you sit down in front of your laptop and SSH into the firewall for the first time to configure it, and You're going to go to a command line because you're an adult, and you're going to start configuring. Because this is all text, a lot of times you're copying and pasting text. So if you do a bunch of these, it gets pretty routine. You can also find sample configuration documents for really any brand firewall online to use as a starting point. You don't have to start from scratch. But the textbook has some very odd rules. It wants to give you some best practices for configuring a firewall, and I have a problem with kind of each one of these. But let's start with all traffic from the trusted network is allowed outbound or egress. Anything that originates inside the network, you're going to allow it to go out. That's not necessarily the case, because you have an ethical obligation as a good system administrator. If a denial of service attack originates within your network, well, you should be blocking that to keep it from going out to the internet, just to be a good internet citizen. Let's see, firewall device is never directly accessed from the public network. I don't know why you would even say that. If you can't access it from the outside, how are you going to configure it remotely? Allowing SMTP data, except this is going to allow lots of phishing, which means you have to add another box that's going to do email security, and we're back to unified threat management. So anything that says always is probably a problem. Block ICMP. Well, what's ICMP? That's ping. It's saying turn off ping to your firewall so people can't see it. Well, you can still see something even if it's not pingable. But I think it's much more useful to leave ICMP enabled just for your own troubleshooting purposes so that you can test it. Turning off just doesn't buy you much at all. Of course, you're not going to allow Telnet, because Telnet is unencrypted. Everything is past clear text. So you should disable the default Telnet protocol and use SSH instead. For web services, yeah, don't bring that ugly web traffic inside your network, of course. I agree with that one. Remember what I said about stupid SPI firewalls that will allow traffic that they can't, or any packet filtering firewall that'll allow traffic if it's not sure. The safer thing to do would be, when in doubt, block it out. Right? When in doubt, block it. The problem is, I think you'll have a bunch of users screaming at you if you do this. This would be good security, but again, because it's a balancing act, you're going to impact end user productivity if you tighten things down too much. So here's what again a sample set of rules, configuration rules for a firewall to make. And it's a sort of decision tree, if you will, again based on IP address and port number, and whether it's going to allow or deny it. Again, a whitelist, blacklist setup. This is for inbound traffic. I mentioned on a previous slide that firewall configuration is ongoing. So you never set and forget your firewall configuration, because new threats develop all the time. There are new port numbers to scan. There are new things to look for. It's become very common to outsource this to a security company, whether it's Checkpoint, WatchGuard, Cisco, whoever, to update your blacklist, whitelist for you as a monthly service, because this does get tricky after a while. But the last rule should always be deny. If it doesn't fall under any of these rules, it should deny it. Similarly, for outbound traffic, if it doesn't fall into any of these buckets, the last line logically is going to be to deny, which gets into the fundamental rule of firewall configuration, which is deny all, allow by exception. This is the right way to do security. Your default is to deny all packets and explicitly allow the traffic that you want based on your business requirements. The problem is, a lot of networks don't do this. A lot of network administrators don't do this, because this means they're constantly adding exceptions, opening up port numbers, opening up different rules to access the network, punching holes in their firewall, in other words. So it's a lot easier to set up your firewall as allow all and deny by exception. Just block the following things and allow everything else. You're going to get a lot more a lot fewer calls from end users complaining. The problem is, this is bad security. This is good security, so you need to do it the right way. And remember what I said about ingress versus egress. One last little point on something that's typically built into a security appliance is something called a content filter. So this isn't really a firewall function per se, and it's certainly going all the way up to layer 5, but if you are wanting to block your end users from going to Facebook, from streaming certain sites, from going certain places, a content filter is going to look at where the traffic is going and if you want to block it or not. And how do you decide if you want to block something? Business requirements. Okay, the last part of the chapter gets into VPNs. Now here's why VPNs are important. If everybody in your company were working at your corporate headquarters and you had a clear perimeter around that corporate headquarters, that would be super easy to protect your end users. The problem is you have a lot of end users that are other physical locations, other offices, other buildings, even traveling around remotely to make sales visits or whatever to their customers. So the number of remote connections that you have into your network can be huge, and you want those remote connections to be secure. It's actually easy to set up a remote connection if you just punch a hole in your firewall, but that's bad security. You want to have an encrypted connection that passes through your firewall and gets safely to the trusted network. So that's what a VPN is good for. And again, the need, whether or not you need a VPN is entirely based on the business requirements. So the best way, the most secure way to have a remote connection is to just purchase a leased line from the telephone company. This is the most secure because it's just your traffic going across that circuit, nobody else's traffic. And it doesn't have to be encrypted at all because it's just your traffic from end to end. But it's super expensive. By expensive, I mean thousands of dollars every month. And the further away it is from your corporate office, the more expensive it's going to be. So that it gets prohibitively expensive unless you're the military or some large organization that has a lot of money to spend on telecom. So really the internet has revolutionized secure remote communications. If you have a virtual private network, virtual is a word in English that means not. It is not a private network. A private network would be a leased line. It is pretending to be a private network just by virtue of the fact that it's encrypting all the transmissions. So turning what is in fact a public network into virtually a private network, but it is kind of a cheat. So a VPN is doing encapsulation, encryption, and authentication. It's important to remember that it's doing all three. And there are two big types of VPN. In 468 we talk about some additional types, but there are two main types. End-to-end and remote access. I've also seen this listed as enterprise VPN or branch office VPN, where you've got two facilities, your remote sales office and your corporate headquarters, that need to communicate securely. You're going to have a VPN concentrator. Usually it's built into your firewall. But this is another feature that you have to pay extra for. You enable the VPN on both sides. It starts encrypting all the traffic, and you just leave it up all the time. You want it to encrypt all the time. As opposed to somebody that's traveling around, they're going to have a mobile VPN client or remote access, depending on what your manufacturer calls it, where they crank up a piece of software, not a piece of hardware, but a piece of software, and they have to authenticate, and that enables the encryption and encapsulation of the VPN. Some of you may use the Cisco VPN client at work today. The most popular VPN encryption protocol, really the only VPN encryption protocol, is IPsec. IPsec, I-P-S-E-C, IPsec, for IP security. Any VPN technology you use is going to be running IPsec on the back end. IPsec is part of TCP/IP, therefore you know it's open source. There's nothing proprietary about IPsec, but the encryption key, that's what you want to keep secret. Yeah, this is an advanced topic, and if your eyes roll up into your head, you can skip this slide. But if you're configuring a firewall, you have to make a very important decision about whether you're going to allow split-level tunneling or not. And there are pros and cons. Let's say this is your laptop and you're in a hotel in Las Vegas. There are two ways to allow internet traffic. One is to crank up the VPN, and all of it goes back and forth across the circuit. So everything's encrypted all the time. In fact, you don't even allow them to connect to the internet without going through a VPN tunnel, which means all of the internet traffic is going to go encrypted across the internet. It's going to decrypt it and send it back to where you're going on the internet, and then the responses are going to go back here and then be encrypted back down the tunnel. That's the secure way to do it. Now the problem is encryption slows down network throughput. Any kind of encapsulation is going to slow down both processing and transmission. So that's one way to do it, but another way is to do split tunneling, which means depending on where the traffic is going, if it's going to your corporate office, like on the 10net network, for example, go ahead and encrypt that, but if it's going anywhere else, don't bother encrypting it. There's no point. If I'm going to CNN.com or something, that can be split out and not encrypted. So some traffic gets encrypted, some doesn't get encrypted. You might want to encrypt all traffic, in fact control all access so that it goes through your content filter to make sure people are going to business related sites and only that. Because really if I didn't want the company to monitor what I was looking at, I would just turn off the VPN and browse whatever the heck I wanted to. What drives this technology decision? Once again, the business requirements. That's right. So split level tunneling is an advanced feature that requires some thought, because once you set this up, you're committed to that architecture. At this point, I normally open things up for classroom discussion to talk about. Some of you do work at some large organizations that use VPNs. I always like to see what brand people are using and if they have any issues using their VPN client. If you've got some examples you want to send me, that'd be excellent. I would love to hear that. But the last thing is there's a lot of detail in the chapter that I want you to read about different authentication protocols. Not that you need to be an expert on these, but you need to recognize that radius, diameter, TACAX, which is the Cisco version, Kerberos, and Sesame are all popular authentication protocols. I've got the picture of Kerberos here, guarding the gate to hell. So a lot of our kind of terminology comes from mythology for some reason, but radius has been around for damn ever. Sesame is newer, TACAX is Cisco. I've never used diameter. There are different ways of setting up authentication, but typically your Active Directory is going to play a role in this as well. But I want you to recognize these as authentication protocols. And that's it. Yeah, cue the theme music. That's a wrap.
Target. Window hotels.
That's a wrap on Chapter 6. And I'll see you in class on Thursday.
Advanced security.
Email me if you have any questions at all.
Phishing, security holes, computer vulnerabilities, application flaws. Standing between them and your company is you.
See ya.